You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by 20th Century Studios' The Amateur. When his wife is murdered, Charlie Heller, the CIA's most brilliant computer analyst, must trek across the globe and use his only weapon, his intelligence, to hunt down her killers and enact revenge. Starring Academy Award winner Rami Malek and Academy Award nominee Lawrence Fishburne. The Amateur. Rated PG-13. Only in theaters April 11th.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 209, The Battle Before Britain, Part 1, Electronic Tripwires. If you have not yet, you should go back and listen to the season introduction episode that released yesterday. It talks about the upcoming episodes and how the Battle of Britain series will be broken down into several mini-series. It also has good information about what you can expect from the next year or so of the podcast. Also, since this marks the beginning of a new season, and I just took a bit of a break, the new member list is a bit lengthy this episode, so thank you to Skylar, Kieran, Melissa, Ben, Jack, David, Ian, Dallas, Tyler, Science and Honor, Max, David, another David, Ben, and Jason for choosing to support the podcast by becoming members, and to Kevin, Lewis, Bono, and longtime supporter of the podcast, Philip, for their donations. You can find out how to support the podcast over at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members. Even before the armistice came into effect on June 22nd and France exited from its active participation in the war, the British were faced with a question. What were they supposed to do moving forward? They had entered the war as part of a coalition against Germany, with France and Britain jointly entering the conflict due to the German violation of Polish territory in September 1939. Over the following 9 months, there was simply nothing but disasters for those two allies. Poland was occupied, then Denmark and Norway. Then the German forces cascaded into Western Europe and occupied the Netherlands and Belgium and then northern France. There were small victories within that time, or mitigations of defeat might be a better term, with events like the evacuation from Dunkirk saving many of the men from the British Expeditionary Force that were almost captured by the Germans. But it seemed like nothing could stop the German ground forces. That was until they reached a bit of water known as the English Channel. When they reached the Channel, the Germans were faced with a new challenge: how to stage an amphibious campaign unlike anything that they had attempted to do before. The next, I guess, in a long line of continental generals that stared across the Channel at the cliffs of Dover and had to devise a way to get men and material across and then keep them supplied during an invasion. To put it bluntly, the German military was not equipped or designed for that type of operation. The largest bodies of water they were designed to cross were the rivers of Europe, and while earlier in the year they had staged the invasion of Norway, that had been on a much smaller scale and had itself cost the German Navy dearly. But even with these new challenges, the Germans had known almost nothing but political and military victory since the Munich Agreement in 1938, but they were now faced with a challenge they had not prepared for. One objective that they believed they could accomplish was the suppression and dismantling of the British Royal Air Force, a prerequisite for any invasion effort, and something that Hermann Goering believed his Luftwaffe could easily accomplish. And why not? They had practically destroyed every air force they had encountered during the war, and in many cases it had not even really been a contest. The German Heer and Kriegsmarine leaders went to work on crafting a plan to take advantage of the expected air superiority to bring their men across the Channel, and they codenamed it Operation Sea Lion. It would involve the use of almost everything the Germans could get their hands on that could float and could cross the Channel. There would be disagreements, as there always were between Army and Navy leaders about amphibious operations, but they would surely be able to sort them all out in time, and in the meantime the Luftwaffe could get to work. In Britain, well, things had not gone well during the war, but in some ways, the situation that the British found themselves in during the summer of 1940 was one that actually should have made them feel more comfortable. Defending their home islands were what the British military was designed to do. For centuries, the Royal Navy had been built and maintained to protect against precisely what the Germans were going to attempt. They were the senior service. They were the longtime protectors of the empire, and the Royal Navy fully intended to play its part, should it be required, with operations planned to throw whatever was required against the German invasion fleet. They were joined by the Royal Air Force, a far younger arm of the British military, having only been formed in 1918, but one that had been heavily invested in during the 1930s, specifically to wage the kind of war it now found itself in. The leaders of the Royal Air Force had always shown disdain for close air support operations of the Army, and now they didn't have to worry about that at all, and instead they could focus all their efforts on offensive bombing operations against the invasion preparations and defending against German bombing attacks by the men and the machines of Fighter Command. What would rapidly become clear is that the Royal Air Force was actually probably more prepared for the battle that was about to take place than the Luftwaffe were, and they were the ones initiating the campaign. And perhaps most importantly, time was on the side of the British, with the window for invasion closing in the later months of the year, which would put a pause on preparations until 1941. The objectives and goals of the RAF were also more clear. All they had to do to win the battle was survive, to continue to exist, to continue to pose a threat. That's all they had to do. But of course, the Battle of Britain, just like so much of the history of the Second World War, is about far more than the relatively small number of pilots that engaged in aerial combat over Britain, the Channel and the North Sea, and northern France during the last 6 months of 1940. The air campaigns of the Second World War brought war home to many on the home front in ways that just a few generations before would have been unthinkable. Bombs would be dropped not just on military targets, not just on economic targets, but simply on the homes of average citizens. The goal was not to inflict physical damage on bodies or buildings, but to inflict psychological damage on the minds of the people and the souls of a nation. Whether it was the daylight bombing during the heights of the invasion scare or the nighttime blitz that followed, the Luftwaffe would attempt to break the spirit of Britain, and it would fail. Because if there was one indisputable rule of strategic bombing that was established during the Second World War, it was that destroying the will of a nation to resist was drastically more difficult than anybody expected. And even the great Allied bombing campaigns of the later war years, where there were orders of magnitude more bombers and, tons of bombs dropped than what the Luftwaffe could accomplish in 1940, would have problems achieving that goal of sort of breaking the will of a nation. The fighting over Britain, when the Luftwaffe launched its campaign, would be one that would also test new technologies and new theories of air power, because the Battle of Britain was a technological battle. The people involved mattered. Of course, the pilots and their aircraft mattered, and also the masses of individuals involved in supporting those machines, both on the airfields and in the factories, and all the people manning the defenses all over Britain, and their families and their supporters. All those people mattered. And that's where this episode will begin, with one of those pieces of technology, and one that I think you could say, if it didn't play a decisive role in the battle that followed, it certainly sort of came onto the world stage in how important it could be in future conflicts, and that was radar. Radar was not a completely new technology in 1940, and had been under pretty constant development in several nations around the world during the 1930s. After being accidentally discovered in 1930, it would spread, and many military leaders saw it for what it could be, and that was a solution to the greatest problem in air power. With the rise of air power during the First World War, one of the major challenges was meeting the enemy in the right numbers at the right time and in the right place. There was a serious advantage for the offensive air force because they could concentrate their aircraft in an area, appear over the battlefield with very little notice, execute their attack, and escape before friendly aircraft could respond. The only real counter to this was through the concept of standing air patrols, where pursuit, later called fighter aircraft, just wandered around in the air in the hope of running into the enemy, a practice that was difficult to sustain in the numbers required, and difficult on pilots due to the required flying hours. Radar, with its ability to at least give some idea of when enemy aircraft were approaching, was a possible solution to this. But before this could be a useful tool, there were many technical problems that had to be overcome. The first of which was that the range of early radar sets was quite small, due to the limit of how much power could be pushed through the radar system and how much could be easily generated for the purpose. However, all this would improve with time. It should also be noted that radar was not the only solution to this problem that was conceived sort of during the interwar years, and there were other options that were investigated in at least some way during that time. This included technologies like one named Silhouette, which would involve massive numbers of searchlights which would illuminate clouds at night to spot enemy bombers. The theory is that eventually, if there was enough light, fighters could wait above enemy bombers and sort of pounce on them when they saw their silhouette. There were also ideas for things like aerial minefields, perhaps held in place by balloons, which would prevent enemy aircraft from flying over cities. Some time was also put into the idea where rockets could be fired into the sky when an enemy raid approached, with the idea being that the rockets could trail long cables with multiple bombs attached, which the enemy aircraft would run into and get tangled up in. Really, it was the Wild West out there in terms of ideas, and any idea had the possibility of being the key thing in the future. But all of them had their problems. It just so happened that radar's problems were the easiest to overcome. An important moment for Britain's preparations for the Second World War would be the creation of the Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defense, or as it's more commonly called, the Tizard Committee, after its chairman, Henry Tizard. The committee would have its first meeting in January 1935, and its goal was to determine the technologies that could best be used to bolster the air defense of the British home islands. They very rapidly made the decision to put their support behind the work on radar and to push forward its development with money and support. The first real set of experiments would take place using a short-wave radio supplied by the BBC, and it was used to detect an aircraft flown by an RAF pilot. These very early tests were very simple, and in this case, all the pilot was required to do was fly between a railway line and another point 20 miles away, and then repeat the process 3 times. During these tests, it was very clear that radio echoes were bouncing back from the aircraft, and this would be the starting point of refinement for future efforts. By September 1935, the general capabilities of British radar were that they could identify that there were aircraft at about 15 miles of distance, and the elevation could roughly be determined. However, there were inaccuracies that would take time to refine and iron out, and over the next several years, the radar systems became both longer reaching and more accurate in terms of elevation, and in determining the path that the aircraft was taking. But the interesting thing about radar, and something that many militaries would discover during the Second World War, is that radar is really just a tool, and it would be how that tool was utilized that would actually determine how effective it could be when defending against an enemy attack. For this purpose, there were efforts made in taking radar and the information that radar provided and integrating it into the operational plans of fighter command and with the tactics used by squadrons of fighters that were best positioned to use the information. This effort began in the summer of 1936, when a team was sent to Biggin Hill to work out the concepts and techniques of radar-controlled interceptions. Basically, how they were going to use the information that radar was going to provide to actually shoot down enemy planes. Then the decisions that this team made were sent up to the head of Fighter Command Hugh Dowding later in 1936, and he made the wise choice of implementing the strategies as doctrine of the RAF Fighter Command to defend against enemy air raids, replacing the old, wasteful standing patrols. The British were taking the first steps towards the combination that would prove so powerful during the summer of 1940. Information about where the enemy was, but just as importantly, the practices and procedures to use that information.
Today at T-Mobile, I'm joined by a special co-anchor.
What up, everybody? It's your boy, Big Snoop Deal Double G.
Snoop, where can people go to find great deals?
Head to T-Mobile.com and get 4 iPhone 16s with Apple Intelligence on us, plus 4 lines for $25.
That's quite a deal, Snoop. And when you switch to T-Mobile, you can save versus the other big guys' comparable plans plus streaming.
Respect. When we up out of here.
See how you can save on wireless and streaming versus the other big guys at T-Mobile.com/switch. Apple Intelligence requires iOS 18.1 or later.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
The British were in no way unique in their investigations into radar, though, and the Germans would do just as much research and development during the 1930s. In some ways, their radar capabilities were actually better in 1940. They were actually more advanced than what the British were working on. The radar systems had better detection and higher resolution. One of the important advantages they had was early research into the use of smaller radio waves in the centimeter wavelengths for the purposes of radar, which would prove to be the most useful for the purpose during the war. To take advantage of this technology, they would create a series of radar stations along the coast to warn them of the approach of any Allied bombing raids. This system would be codenamed Freya, and it would be used to create 8 radar stations for aircraft detection, and then 3 surface radars that were used for naval ship detection. These radar stations would almost immediately prove their worth when, on the second day of the war, RAF Bomber Command sent a raid against the German naval forces anchored at Wilhelmshaven. The raid was detected by the Germans, but they were unable to intercept the British bombers before they dropped their bombs and were on their way back home. This was partially due to the fact that the Germans had not put enough emphasis on the operational side of radar during the years before the war. They had not done a great job of putting the processes and procedures in place to use the information that they were getting to the best of their abilities. They sort of neglected the entire area of investigation and refinement. The most important reason for this is that there was a kind of gulf between the German scientific efforts on radar and the military leaders that would be required to use the information. There was not the equivalent of that team at Biggin Hill, whose sole purpose was to build out how the information would be used, although the Germans were, as always, quick learners. When another raid was sent several months later, the German fighters would use the early warnings from the radar sets to exact a heavy toll on the British bombers, with less than half of the British bombers making it home. It's also worth noting that the Germans knew that the British were working on radar, and the British knew that the Germans were. This was not really a secret technology, although the exact capabilities of another nation's radar systems were not easily determined. It was known that they were being worked on. One thing that made it more difficult to determine the enemy capabilities is that in these early days, everybody was using different radio frequencies for their radar systems. So it was not always easy to even find the frequencies that the other nation was using, particularly at a time when the range of the radar systems were so short. While our focus during this series will be on the use of radar systems designed to detect enemy aircraft, there was also a huge amount of work going on in the area of development and deployment of naval radars. During the war, naval radar would prove to be just as important to the course of naval operations than as the shore-based radars were to aviation and airborne operations. The Royal Navy, as would so often happen before the Second World War, was the first to bring this new technology into operational use, although their systems were not as advanced as what particularly the Americans were building at the time. One of the challenges that the Royal Navy faced is that there was an emphasis among the British scientific teams to use as many of sort of off-the-shelf parts as possible, which would allow for a faster and cheaper creation of more radar sets that could be placed aboard ship. But this often meant that the equipment just was not as powerful as what could have been produced with more money and more time. But both of these were kind of in short supply, until the late 1930s. So the earlier research and the earlier deployments were all of these cheaper sort of off-the-shelf parts, sort of kits. To make matters worse, the majority of the British radar efforts were still being placed on air defense radar technology, which had a very different set of constraints when compared with naval radar sets. Most importantly, size and power draw was not something that land-based systems had to really be concerned about. They could just be made larger and could use more power if they needed to. All of these challenges meant that the first naval radar sets, which would be put to test in March 1937, were difficult to use, with range problems and general blind spots due to how they could be mounted aboard ships. But the utility was very clear, and advancement would be quite rapid over the 3 years that followed from 1937 to 1940. The Germans were also, of course, working on naval radars as well, with their first naval radar set being mounted on the Deutschland-class cruiser, the Admiral Graf Spee, in 1936. Most of the German naval efforts around radar would eschew air search radar in favor of surface search and fire control, which was primarily driven by what they saw as the threats that they would be facing in a coming conflict, with the most dangerous threat being seen as British surface ships, not aircraft. The Americans and the Japanese would also have their own radar efforts, which would both be on display in both positive and negative ways after they entered the war in 1941, but we've got some stuff to talk about before we get to that point. The end result of the British investments in radar during the 1930s would be the Chain Home system, which was really just the name of a string of radar stations that were put in place along the coasts to warn of German air raids. The Chain Home system was really built out of 2 different types of radar. The first to be introduced was the Chain Home radars, which featured masts that were 360 feet tall and placed 180 feet apart. Between these 2 masts were wires that were kind of strung back and forth, which would be energized to send out the radio pulses, and then the echoes of which would be captured by 4 different masts that were 240 feet tall. This system did work, but it had some limitations which would be quite important. The 2 most important of these limitations was the direction of the radar and the altitude that they could detect aircraft. Because the entire system was based on fixed structures, it could only detect aircraft coming from one direction, which was not as much of a downside as you might expect, because it was generally clear where the German air raids would be coming from out to sea. However, it did mean that once the German aircraft moved out of the cone of vision of Chain Home, it was up to either aircraft or ground spotters to keep track of them as they moved through British airspace. This is one of the reasons that coast watchers and the good old Mark I eyeball would be an important part of British air defense networks during the early war years. The other problem was that it was possible for aircraft to fly under the altitude from which Chain Home could detect them, due to how the area covered by Chain Home interacted with its visible range. With perfect knowledge of the system, RAF pilots were able to determine that if they picked the correct spot between 2 Chain Home systems, they could remain completely undetected as long as they remained under an altitude of 460 meters. Now, they had perfect information about everything, so the chances of a German aircraft just lucking in to be in the correct spot in the exact right altitude was somewhat small, but it could happen. To try and solve these problems, a new series of stations were put in place, the Chain Home Low system. The Chain Home Low system had several advantages, most of which were because it used a higher frequency and involved antennas that could be shifted to different angles. Importantly for the overall structure of the Chain Home system, it could detect aircraft at a lower altitude, which reduced the risks of German aircraft flying under the Chain Home's ability to detect them. It also meant that they could detect German aircraft earlier even if they were lower. Because of how the Chain Home systems were put together, they could still detect at a very low altitude, but only as they got closer and closer to the radar system. But what you really want from a radar system is to detect the enemy as far away as possible, and that's where the Chain Home Low systems were there to help. Now, the structure of the Chain Home Low sites also involved the same type of transmitting and receiving towers. They were a slightly different structure. It doesn't really matter. And one of the interesting things about how these were put together is that it made them very difficult for the Germans to actually destroy, because there was nothing that really could be damaged unless they could directly hit one of the towers. They were very hardy structures. They were sort of open steel grid system type of construction. So think of something like the Eiffel Tower, how the Eiffel Tower is built. It was something like that. And what that meant is that they could only really be disabled by a direct hit because shrapnel didn't really impact them. They was just steel beams. This allowed them to continue to work and continue to detect German aircraft, which they could detect out to about 320 kilometers, which is about 200 miles. But the Chain Home Low system had a slightly lower range, 200 kilometers or 120 miles, but they worked quite well together. There were three critical pieces of information that these radar systems could give the RAF. The first and most obvious was that there were enemy aircraft flying towards Britain. That was sort of the most important bit of information that they could possibly provide. The second was how large the group of aircraft was, although this was far from a perfect process and there was some margin of error there. The third, and just as important, was the altitude of the aircraft. This was a piece of information that was absolutely critical to the ability of the British to successfully intercept the raid, due to the climb rate of aircraft during the Second World War, and the general importance placed on being above the target when beginning an attack. All of these pieces of information were worthless, though, when it came to actually intercepting an enemy aircraft, because what the British needed was a way to actually use that information. That process we will cover in a later episode, but it is why the entire system worked, because it involved getting the information from the radar sites all the way down to the specific squadrons of fighters that were ready to leave their airfield. But before we talk about that system, next episode will be focused on the opposite problem that radar was trying to solve. Because while detecting inbound enemy bombers was important, on the flip side, it was also critical for the bombers to be able to find their targets. And that was actually way more difficult than anybody expected, especially when the bombers were flying at night.